But
Well, maybe we should start here. I think we're being recorded. And Matt, do you have the Cantos PDF?
I do. Do you want it on the first of the Pisan cantos?
No, I'm going to have you roll it back a little bit because I wanted to make a few comments and then um, back up just slightly and take a running leap into the Pisan Cantos.
Okay.
But I'll tell you what page when I want to cue it up, but I thought it might be worth uh, talking about the modes of composition. Maybe that's an awfully fancy um, phrasing for saying how and in what way was Ezra Pound writing. And as we go into the piece on cantos, we're approximately 25 to 30 years after Pound had started the poem. And I thought I'd go over a little bit some of his ideas, the modes of composition, the types of writing that he's doing, the types of things he's introducing into the cantos, because I assume that everyone here is an artist, a writer, or takes a deep interest in how art and poetry are composed. And so there are various terms that are used to describe certain aspects of Pound's composition practices or his ways of writing. And I want to just go back through a few of them because the piece on cantos are so very different from what came before. And this may give us all a little bit of a handle on how to approach the piece on cantos. I think they're a real departure in many ways from what came before. But the biggest departure would be that the methods of writing that Pound uses are not the ones that he had developed over the previous, let's say, 30 or 35 years of his writing. So, first of all, three of these interesting terms that we've talked about and I've brought up a number of times. The first is the image or imagism. And if you remember, Pound began sort of hammering out principles of imagism with his friends, Hilda Doolittle, friend and former girlfriend, and her husband, Richard Aldington. And they had a circle of other people who came around. And the only reason I think that anybody was interested in turning a principle into a movement was that it was a time when all writers and maybe artists had seen 100 years of isms, symbolisms, and impressionisms, and post-impressionism, and um, various things. So the original idea behind imagism had to do with the image, and Pound's definition was very straightforward. An image is an intellectual and emotional complex held in a moment of time. Um, we looked we looked at one point the sort of great haiku like image that he'd created and became, in some ways, the emblem or the definition of imagism, the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. And he had titled that In a Station of the Metro. So, very haiku like, the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. And that would be the most famous instance of imagism. But Pound really was thinking about the poetry of his friend HD or Hilda Doolittle when he coined the idea. A couple of times I've brought back this line from the cantos, one scarlet petal on the blanch white stone. And that I had put forward partly as an image, an intellectual and emotional complex held in a moment of time, but I also wanted to elaborate on that when we came to it. But let's just hold for the moment the sense of the image. Once imagism seemed to be too limiting and also too static, Pound and a few of his friends came up with the idea of the vortex. And the vortex was really with reference to a number of the artists that Pound was around, but you could simply say it was far more dynamic view of an image. In a sense, the image was now not just a static moment in time, not an intellectual and emotional complex held in a moment in time, but a vortex would be something like an image or a symbol or an emblem through which the past flows into the future. There's a real dynamism there if you can feel the sense of the vortex. And in a way, if you wanted to get a feel for what it may not actually be a vortex, but Canto 1 with that visit to the dead feels to me when Odysseus goes to visit the dead and speak to Tiresias about the future, in a way that becomes a wonderful emblem of vorticism as a whole. You make your sacrifice, you pour the blood of the dead sheep into the trenches at Hell's Mouth, and all of the past comes swarming up, all the shades, all the ghosts, everybody who you've ever known who's died, and everybody you've ever heard about who has died. However, the idea is not to talk to all those shades of the past coming up. The point is to speak to Tiresias, who has the gift of prophecy or foresight to see the future. So, in a way, you could say that Canto 1 is a fabulously conceived image of vorticism. All of the past comes through that simple image of the L square Pitkin that Pound has dug. I mean, yeah, the Pound is dug in the voice of Odysseus and then slaughtered the sheep and poured their blood in there for the dead to come up. But the focus is on Tiresias and the council about how to move forward, how to get home. Um, so, imagism, vorticism, and then out of his studies of the Chinese language and Chinese poetry, the third really important term would be the ideogram, which is to say, you're bringing into an alignment numerous elements in order to see something larger than the elements themselves. And even though this is a much discredited view of the way the Chinese language works, or maybe it's just true enough that um, most sinologists or scholars of Chinese have taken great pains to debunk it as a theory, even though it's debunked as a theory for the Chinese language. It became incredibly fertile for Pound's composition, and many writers who came after Pound, I think particularly of people like Gary Snyder, Philip Whalen, Allen Ginsberg, Joanne Kiger, how you can set into alignment different characters out of history, different time frames, different voices. Uh, Not so much that these are things in themselves, but you're looking for a higher um, truth in a way, or a higher resolution of the material that you're bringing in. And Pound, particularly with historical periods. So he's rhyming Helen of Troy with Eleanor of Aquitaine. He's rhyming the troubadour Pere Vidal, who's torn apart by hounds because he wears wolfskin, with Actaeon from the Tale of Ovid. He's rhyming the usures that Dante found down in the Inferno with the bankers and munitions manufacturers of today. So the ideogram is a way in which Pound felt that he could get his reader to see. I've often called them rhymes, rhymes through history, that the same kind of forces operate throughout history, the same kinds of figures appear repeatedly. I was actually very curious yesterday. I was reading a book published in 1986 kind of a book on natural and cultural history of the bear and study of bear mythologies around the world, but also natural history. And the two writers said that the bear is an ideogram for humans in the wilderness. And I thought, that's very interesting. This is a term that Ezra Pound set in motion. And when these two writers use the idea of an ideogram, if the bear is an ideogram, what they've done is they've looked cross culturally at mythologies, at natural history accounts, at the black bear, the grizzly bear, the polar bear, the uh, the panda bear, the various bears, the Himalayan black bear, and seeing all of them as in some way representative of what it is like for humans to move around in the wilderness. So that got me very curious. Ideogram, when did this start to become a more common term? So I went to my American Heritage Dictionary, probably the last dictionary I will ever buy in my life. I bought it in 1993, but now the internet seems to have usurped everything. But the 1993 American Heritage, under ideogram, simply said it's a graphic symbol or it's a representation by an image or symbol that doesn't use the expression of the sound. And the example they gave is like a stop sign. Everybody sees the stop sign. There's nothing there saying stop. We just see it. Or maybe even better, a symbol like of a dog with a red circle around it and a slanted line through it. So that's what the American Heritage had to say in 1993. So I went to the OED and looked at the 1987 OED supplement under ideogram, and they cite both Ezra Pound and Ezra Pound's early and masterful critic, Hugh Kenner, under both ideogram and ideogrammic method. So the OED was much more up to date. And they quoted sort of a wonderful thing. Since I'm looking at a number of you, I see Ingrid there has a bookshelf behind you. Miguel, you have a bookshelf behind you. Stanley, you have a bookshelf. Amy, you have a bookshelf. Lauren, a bookshelf. CJ, a bookshelf. I see books up there behind you, Mary. Hugh Kenner simply talks about how the books on your shelf form an ideogram of your mind. So that's a
Okay.
great way of thinking of it. What is it? What are your interests, your passions? What are your old studies? What are your aspirations for the future? So there's an ideogram. Uh, Interesting to me that the American Heritage, the American Dictionary, didn't have Ezra Pound's definition, while the OED was all over it and had extensive quotes. How they quote often the historical use of terms. So the historical use of ideogram in the sense of a composition technique or the ideogrammic method. By 1987, the OED was citing not just Ezra Pound, but writers about Ezra Pound's method of composition. I think the American Heritage needs to come up to date. So, image, vortex, ideogram as methods of composition. Other methods that are more, maybe less cerebral and better known. The cantos open with a whole canto practically that's a translation. And we've looked at translations so much throughout. Ezra Pound working right off of books on his desk. There's a distribution or arrangement of materials, many fragments. Could call it collage. Maybe that would be a good place to just like hold our thoughts on that, a kind of collaging of elements, often translated elements. We've looked at cantos in which Pound is collaging material from over 10 lines, Catullus, Ovid, Propertius, Sappho, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Bernard de Ventadorn. So a sort of collaging or arrangement of elements. let's see. The other thing I wanted, then the next thing would be condensation of texts. Think of that, condensation of text. And we've really skipped over where Pound did his major job with that, which is Cantos 52 to 71, the Chinese cantos, 10 of them, in which Pound condensed a multi-volume history of China into 10 poetry cantos. And then the following cantos, 10 cantos, are the John Adams letters, in which Pound takes John Adams' letters and condenses them into another 10 uh, cantos. But there are many other instances we saw throughout. Then we started to look at things like copying of material. Last week, we saw how Pound had copied in a letter from his daughter. His daughter sent a letter that was just reporting what was going up in the Tyrol, northern Italy, and Pound seems to have word for word entered it into a canto, followed by entries from a fly fishing manual that was sitting nearby. We've also seen him condense, add this into translation and condense things from Hesiod. We've seen him condense letters of Sigismundo Malatesta. We've seen him condense letters of Thomas Jefferson. We've seen him condense lines from Sappho, poetry lines from Sappho. So that condensation of text being a major compositional element. A little different than the condensation of text is a recapping of books, recapping of things that he's lifted from medieval history, recapping of material he's taken out of economics treatises, recapping of conversations with friends of his. So a sort of, that's close to condensing text, but it's not the same thing really as working directly to translate text condensed into poetry. It's more Pound reading and deciding that he's going to mix in medieval history, art history, the development of banks. He's reading back and forth in economic treatises. There's storytelling. Quite a few, first person tales that he tells, not always being himself who's the teller of the tale. Some of them may be his aunt who took him on a tour of Europe. Some of it may be friends of his. Some of it may be remembered conversations with friends. So, a standard thing we're used to seeing in poetry where you tell stories and often tell stories in the voice of another character. And I would say the compression of text and storytelling really happens in cantos 52 to 71, those Chinese cantos and the John Adams cantos. So I wanted to bring out all of these things, the translation, the condensation of texts, the arrangement of found material, the direct copying of letters, the direct copying of all sorts of material, economic treatises, fly fishing manuals, classical mythology, poems by dozens of figures, recappings of Confucius, all this material that he has brought in out of what seems to be a fairly enormous effort to, as he said early on in the Malatesta cantos, these fragments I have shelved against my ruins. These fragments, he's shelving them against his ruins and he's pulling them out of books. The big change when he comes to Pisa is that he's being put in a tiny, highly guarded cage with no books. He's now going to write exclusively, as we would say, out of his own mind, really. And yet it's a mind that is really, really full of material, full of poetry, full of ideas, but he does not have books next to him. And this is going to be a huge change, that he's working from memory alone, or not quite alone. What is he supplementing his memory with? He's got two books he slipped into his pocket when he was arrested, a Chinese dictionary and a collection of the sayings of Confucius. So he's got two books with him. He gets the occasional news magazine, rather out of date, but in some ways contemporary, that shows up in the detention training center where he's being imprisoned. And we'll start to see at some point there's an old anthology of English language poetry which he finds in the outhouse, which the prisoners are using as simply toilet paper. So that book gets thinner and thinner, but it does give him access to one other book. So if you think of a man whose entire poem has been built thus far out of fragments and condensings and translations and working with books, he's now reduced to basically a Chinese dictionary and a diminishing old anthology of English poetry from the outhouse and the occasional Newsweek or Time magazine that manages to find its way via GIs into the detention training center. Now, I want to recap just really quickly. The other thing that's so important is whatever the actuality of his biography at this point, he believes he's on death row. He's literally on death row, and he believes he may be taken out and hung or shot any day. And he's seeing prisoners in the cages alongside him being taken out and hung. So he's a witness of that. So he's in a very extreme state of mind. And I think the reason the Pisan Cantos are the place that most people go back to again and again is they're the most visionary of all the cantos. I think Pound reduced with no library and reduced to a sort of bare stick of a human being whose fate is completely in the hands of armed guards, as he would feel it. This is a place when he starts to have visions. I think he's had visions before, but now is the time that they're really going to start to come out. Pound, interestingly, his visions go into his poetry. I think a lot of people have visions and turn to religion in some way. Visions are sort of standard conversions, conversion points for people, religious conversions. That never happens to Pound. The visions go into his poetry. And I think visions require a really different method for Pound than he has used before. You don't get visions typically out of a book. You don't get visions when you're digging in dictionaries and trying to translate old poems. Visions come from some different place. So I don't even want to name what that is, but I will say that, and this I will say particularly to Paul Nelson, who's not with us today, but that the Pisan Cantos, I think, are what Charles Olson meant when he wrote his essay, his really groundbreaking essay, Projective Verse. A friend of mine recently wrote me about Olson's projective verse. Isn't he just describing the Pisan Cantos? And I think that's, in a way, what we're really moving into now. You could apply backwards projective verse to previous cantos, but I think it's the Pisan Cantos where something different really happens, and you will see it on the page, and you will hear it in the lines, and you will feel it, that sense that Olson had in projective verse, that one perception moves directly onto another perception. This is not like one line of poetry moves on to another line of poetry, one line of translation, or one book moves on to another book, or one story moves on to another story. This is perception, and Pound's perceptions are going both inwards and outwards. And this is one of the things that makes, I think, the Pisan Cantos so remarkable, is the tracking of Pound's own perceptions, looking outside, seeing things going on in the detention center, and then going back inside and dwelling in memory, pulling out his recollections of his friends. And remember now, again, he's cut off from his friends, he's cut off from his family. What he does know is that a number of his friends have died during the war, very specifically William Butler Yeats, James Joyce. Um, Other friends of his have been injured in battle. Other friends of his have just disappeared because there's been no mail coming into Italy. And now something very different is going on. So this kind of projectivist method, which is not easy to define, projective verse is one of those essays of Charles Olson, like all of Olson's essays in a way, which is one day you read it and it's lucidly clear and you're having remarkable insights into exactly how Olson is describing the composition of poetry. And then the next day you go back and read it and it's incomprehensible. What is this guy talking about? What is this? Is this some mishmash of Alfred North Whitehead and Charles Olson's amphetamine and alcohol? And then you go back the third day and it's lucid again. So, I challenge all of you to, try reading projective verse 3 days in a row and see what happens to you. What happens to Ezra Pound, though, is the visions. And some of the figures that are going to start to show up are Kwannon or Kuan Yin, the Buddhist goddess of mercy from China and Japan. A very mysterious figure called Dryad, one of the most beautiful of the lyrical passages is to Dryad, which was Ezra Pound's name for HD. But we are going to look at another canto just as a warm up to the piece on cantos. Let's see, I don't want to let this get away from me. The name of the bear book, Adelia, is The Sacred Paw by a guy named Paul Shepard and a guy named Barry Sanders. And it's gotten afterwards by Gary Snyder, and it's a kind of mix of natural history, cultural history, mythology, and it was published in 1986, so should be able to find it out there, The Sacred Paw. Before we start to read, any comments or questions or anything anybody would like to leaven our, session with? Anybody read projective verse recently other than Paul Nelson, who isn't here? You have, Matt. How's my description of it? Does that meet your own experience?
Yeah, I mean, Olson kind of does come in and out a bit. Although I do find projective verse a little bit more lucid overall than, say, like some of the stuff out of Human Universe, even though, like, I like the incomprehensibility because it gets into the whole notion of that you can't really know the universe except until you're tuned into it. So
It's also instrumentally about the typewriter. And
mhm.
the only photograph I have ever seen of Ezra Pound at a typewriter is a much circulated one of him in the medic's tent in the detention center at Pisa, tapping away with two fingers at a typewriter. And he really figured out to do something very different with the typewriter there. He must have had a typewriter before, but I don't know for sure what his composition was like. What we do know is that the piece on cantos were originally being written on toilet paper, and then once he got access to the typewriter, he was able to begin to type it on typing paper. And then once he had a typewriter, he could really let loose. Um, if nobody else has a comment or a question, I think what we'll do, Matt, is go to page, this is the current edition of the Cantos. What I want to do is go to the Salo Cantos and just to recap the little bit of history. 1944, Mussolini had been deposed in Italy and imprisoned. A gang of German commandos sprung him and brought him up north and reinstated him as the kind of emperor of a puppet government, which didn't last long. And meanwhile, Allied forces were moving up Italy from the south, the Americans and the British in particular, but other fighting forces. And before they got up to where Mussolini was sequestered in Salo, a group of Italian partisans sprung him from jail and executed him and his mistress or his girlfriend, and brought the corpses back to Milan and strung them up in the town square of Milan. So 1944 was a major year in Italy. You had Italian forces splintering and on the run. You had Germans in the north. There were Americans and British and probably French and maybe other troops coming in from the south. And there was widespread panic and enormous amount of confusion and hunger. This was a real war zone, Italy was. And Ezra Pound wrote two cantos in Italian, Cantos 72, which is here, and Canto 73. His family suppressed them both, and they were added in to a much later edition of the cantos. In fact, not until I think 15 or more years after his death, I think maybe around 1986. Later, a translation Pound did of Canto 72 into English appeared, and this is what we're going to read now. And I think that you need to think of this as the war is recognized to be winding down, but the destruction is being accelerated in Italy. This is a canto full of spirits, and I think it's based on some Japanese no plays that Ezra Pound translated back in 1915. Most of the commentators says it's more like Dante. Spirits step forward and talk to Pound, but that would be equally good description of what goes on in many of the Japanese no plays that Ezra Pound translated. But the place where it feels a little bit like both Dante and the no plays is that this is set in the future. War is still raging. This is 1944. Armistice has not been declared. Italy is falling, but has not quite fallen because there are still fighting forces out there. Yet it's being sort of from the very opening line, you can see in a sense that it's set into the future. So I'm going to read this and stop for a little bit of commentary. If one begins to remember the dung war, certain facts will well up again. In the beginning, God, the great aesthete, having created heaven and earth, and after the volcanic sunset, had painted the rocks with lichen in Japanese manner. Just hang on for a moment to those lines. We're looking into the future. There's almost like a mock biblical tone that Pound is taking here. There's some humor here. In the beginning, God, the great aesthete, having created heaven and earth, and after the volcanic sunset, had painted the rocks with lichen in Japanese manner, exuded the great usurer Geryon, Geryon straight out of Dante, the great usurer Geryon, prototype of Churchill's backers. Pound is thinking here of the way Churchill devastated the country of India and is still devastating the country of India. I don't know how many of you know this, but the British Empire in Churchill's years supported its entire war effort, World War I and World War II, as well as its empire by what it was taking out of India. So the great usurer Geryon, prototype of Churchill's backers. And there came Filippo Tommaso in rough dialect with H for C. Okay, Filippo Tommaso is still alive at the time Pound is writing this, though he may be on his deathbed. This is Filippo Tommaso, Marinetti, the Italian futurist who was author of the Futurist Manifesto. He had been for a while the lover of Mina Loy, who was a friend of Pound's up in Paris, the great British and later American poet Mina Loy, who's buried a few stone throws from me in Aspen, Colorado. Um, but Filippo Tommaso, as a futurist and as a fascist, um, was a great backer of Italy in the war. And his agenda was not so much pro Mussolini as it was that he thought Europe had gotten old and dead and relying too much on the past. And futurism was about wiping out the past and embracing the future, science, technology, engineering. Um, Marinetti had himself been a fighter pilot for a while. And one of the things that makes his poetry hard to stomach is that he looks down at bombs he's seeing his battalion dropping and aestheticizes the explosions below him. But that, in a sense, is what futurism is. So notice the change here. We've got um, a sort of mock in the beginning, God created heaven and earth, moving very quickly to God exuding the great usurer Geryon prototype of Churchill's backers. And there came singing right there in the middle of the line, the switch from Geryon and the Churchill's backers to there came singing Filippo Tommaso Marinetti in rough dialect with H for C. All right, I am dead, but do not want to go to heaven. I want to go on fighting, and I want your body to go on with the struggle. Okay, stop for a moment. Ezra Pound, born 1885. Marinetti was actually born earlier, 9 years earlier, 1876. But he is saying to Pound, all right, I am dead, but do not want to go to heaven. I want to go on fighting, and I want your body to go on with the struggle. And I answered, my body is already old. I need it. Where would I go? But I will give you a place in a canto, giving you voice. But if you want to go on fighting, go take some young chap, flaccid and a half-wit, to give him a bit of courage and some brains, to give Italy another hero among so many, thus to be reborn and thus become a panther and so know the second birth and die a second time, not old in bed, but die to sound of trumpets and come to paradise. If you're scoring lines or making notes in your cantos, that line is really worth tagging. And so know the second birth and die a second time. Just that one line, because that's going to be the opening of the piece on cantos for us. Thus to be reborn and thus become a panther. And so know the second birth and die a second time. Not old in bed, but die to sound of trumpets and come to paradise. You have already done purgatory and the time of the collapse. Go make yourself a hero again and leave the talking to me. And let me explain, sing of the eternal war between light and mud. Goodbye, Marinetti. Come back and talk when you want to. Presente! And after that shout, he added sadly, I followed vain emptiness in many ways, show more than wisdom, and knew not the ancient sages, nor read Confucius and Mencius. I sang war, and you wanted peace. Both of us blind, me to the inner things, you the things of today. and he spoke to me, neither wholly to me nor to the next man, but a part of himself, talked to himself, and not to its center, and his shade grew grayer until another note of the scale came from the hollow emptiness. There's an interesting thing here where he's got this voice of Marinetti appearing to him. And Marinetti, I find this so prescient. This is, in a way, the most insight Pound has to his own method of study and what he's driving for. Up at the top again, the fifth line, where Marinetti says, I followed vain emptiness in many ways, show more than wisdom, and knew not the ancient sages, nor read Confucius and Mencius. I sang war, and you wanted peace. Both of us blind, me to the inner things, you the things of today. Look at how the lines now are being laid out on the page. We have not seen this before. This is starting, something different is beginning to happen here. And he spoke to me, neither wholly to me nor to the next man, but a part of himself talked to himself and not to its center, and his shade grew grayer until another note of the scale came from the hollow emptiness. The nostrils vomit spirits of flame. And I said, Torquato Dazzi, have you come? Okay, quick gloss here. Torquato Dazzi was a Italian writer that Pound knew. He's best known for his translations out of Latin, born in 1891, so just slightly younger than Pound. But the second spirit has shown up now. And I said, Torquato Dazzi, have you come? Sing a lullaby of the verses you translated 20 years ago to wake Musato. You making a pair with Marinetti, you wanting the past too much, he the future. Too much eagerness shoots past the mark. That line there is straight out of Confucius. Too much eagerness shoots past the mark. He's got Torquato Dazzi, who wants the past too much, Marinetti, who wants the future too much, and both of them too eager, and they shoot past the mark. He, Marinetti, he wanted to clear away too much. And now we see more destruction than he wanted. Then the first spirit impatiently, as if the news were urgent and would not be bothered with matters of less importance, went on, and I recognized Marinetti's voice as I had heard it in Piazza Adriana, Lungo Teverde. Go on, go on, from Macaulay on the far edge of Gobi, where a white skull sang from the white sand. Catch a moment just there, that's like Pound's rhythm of the image. A white skull sang from the white sand, not seeming weary, but sang and went on singing. Alamein, Alamein, we will return, return. I said, I believe you, and that answer seemed to quiet him. But the other spirit came back with the refrain, were I less than a bull? A verse from the Essernide, translated from the Latin. So this is Torquato Dazzi again, with a translation as his from the Latin, but did not finish the verse because all the air trembled and the shadows trembled as with a collapse, as thunder shaking the rain, blazing phrases without sense shot through the rain, a grating noise inside the submarine when the beam strikes it. I heard the spirit as if in torture. Guelph slander, they have always used calumny. This is straight out of the period of Dante, the slander of the Guelphs in Florence. They have used calumny. The dung flow has got to Bologna, as in the old war, through Romagna, rape and fire as far as Bagnacavallo. The buried dust unlids itself in the depths and moves and breathes and suffers in trying to drive out the foreigners and come to life again. And I saw many in my time made of dirt, and history shows them in a dirty series, who betrayed city and province, who sold Italy and the empire. Rimini burned and Forlì destroyed. Just stop there for a moment. Who remembers what Rimini is? Where Rimini is that we've had instrumentally? Rimini is the town where Sigismundo built his Tempio, that is Pound's spiritual architectural center and the model for his cantos, all the many different styles of art that Malatesta brought to Rimini and had. He brought artists, he brought sculptors, painters, architects, craftsmen, marble carvers, and he created this great collage-like tempio at Rimini. And Pound is heard, and this was a rumor going around all of Italy, the Rimini had been bombed and the tempio destroyed and burned. And it turned out the tempio had been damaged, not destroyed, but this is the end of the war. This is the panic, the collapse, and Italy falling apart. And Pound has heard that Rimini burned and Forlì destroyed. Who will see Gemistos' sepulchre, the arches down and the walls of the divine Ishota's resting place, and its symbolic designs burnt out? If we went over it very quickly back in those Malatesta cantos, but Gemisto was a Neoplatonist who had been buried in, or really cremated in Turkey, and was widely viewed as one of the people who had brought in a Neoplatonic metaphysic as a counter to Christianity, and had died in what is contemporary Turkey. Sigismundo Malatesta had gone there on a military campaign, not successful, but he did retrieve the ashes of Gemisto and brought them back to his Tempio and interred them in a sepulcher outside the walls of his Tempio. He had, I think, something like 9 sepulchres that he wanted to fill with remains of the great philosophers of the past as part of this development. So Gemisto's ashes in the sepulcher, and of course the Tempio itself, built for Malatesta's beloved Ishota or Ixota, who was interred there. So scroll up just a line or two, Matt, and we'll look at this page again. Who sold out Italy and the empire, Rimini burned, and Forlì destroyed. Who will see Gemisto's sepulchre, the arches down, and the walls of the divine Ishota's resting place, and its symbolic designs burnt out? This is all this voice of this spirit speaking. And I cried out, "Who are you?" against the fury of the whirlwind. "Are you Sigismundo?" But the presence did not listen, but in a rage shouted, "A Borgia would be more likely than a Pacelli to house clean. Sixtus was son of a usurer, and all their gang, from Peter the Denier and all followers of fattened usury, and come groaning to you that Farinacci has rough hands because he has seen through the swindle. He has one rough hand and has given the other, and for that is honored by the heroes. There are a lot of them: Talera, Malete, Miele, De Carolus and Lorenzini, Guido, Piacenza, Orsi, and Pradieri, and Baldassare, Borsorelli, and Volpini, to name only the generals. Clement was son of a banker, and Leo Decimo, son of a usurer. I said, "Who are you?" "I am that Ezzelino who didn't believe the world was made by a Jew," and other outbreaks that don't matter now, and was betrayed by the man who betrayed your friend, i.e. Musato. Um, so this is a spirit of Ezzelino, who was, well, we'll hear a little bit more about him in a moment, i.e. Musato, who wrote that I was the son of the devil. And if you believe such nonsense, you are a donkey that will follow any carrot dangled before your nose, or that Adonis was killed by a boar to make the more fair Cyprian weep. If I made a toy of reason, I would say a bull for slaughter is worth a pigeon. One taking pleasure in fables will say religion doesn't depend on the animal. One single falsehood does more in a murderous world than all my outbreaks. Spider, spider, get that beast out of its hole. If it isn't this, the human beast loves its fetters. If ever the emperor made that gift, Byzantium mothered the commotion. He did it without form, illegally, severing from himself and justice. Caesar didn't split himself to fragments. Peter was no rock before Augustus, but all the powers and functions. The possessor only can be legal giver, and the Florentines understood the Ghibelline case. Confusion of voices is from several transmitters, broken phrases. Catch this line for a moment. Remember that Ezra Pound has been broadcasting on on Rome radio, and those who listen to his transmissions probably describe it as this: confusion of voices from several transmitters, broken phrases, and many birds singing in counterpoint. In the summer morning, and through their twitterings a suave tone, I was Placidia and slept beneath the gold. Woman's melancholy and gentleness, I began to say, and then my skin tense between my shoulder blades and my wrist seized in such an iron grip that I could move neither wrist nor shoulder. And I saw a fist grasping my wrist, but saw no forearm, holding me fast as a nail in the wall. This sounds foolish to anyone who has not been through it. Then the voice that had been raging said fiercely, but not unfriendly, paternal rather, as one in midst of battle guiding an inexperienced youth, "The will is old, but the hand is new. Listen to me before I turn back into the night where the skull sings, the regiments and the banners will return."
And they have.
I don't think there's been anything like this in the Cantos before. I mean, look at this, just this page 437. My skin tensed between my shoulder blades, and my wrist seized in such an iron grip that I could move neither wrist nor shoulder. And I saw a fist grasping my wrist, but saw no forearm. Where does this come from? This is not out of One Pound's books. This is something, this, whatever this figure is that has appeared to him, this medieval figure, historian Ezzelino. I saw a fist grasping my wrist, but saw no forearm, holding me fast as a nail in the wall. This sounds foolish to anyone who has not been through it. Then the voice that had been raging said fiercely, but not unfriendly, paternal rather. I mean, remember here, Pound here is now, what would he be, 50? He's 59 years old. And this fist that's grabbed him is now talking to him as one in midst of battle, guiding an inexperienced youth. The will is old, but the hand is new. Listen to me before I turn back into the night, where the skull sings, the regiments and the banners will return. I totally understand why this was suppressed by Pound's family. I also find it utterly terrifying. There's a level of intense vision going on here. These three different spirits that show up: Marinette, Torquato Dazzi, and then this spirit of Esolino, who in the end, well, Esolino, I should say, was born in 1195. So he is, sort of 750 years earlier than Ezra Pound. And he shows up with an old will and a new hand and pins Pound to the wall, and all they can see is this disembodied hand. I find it just an extraordinary moment. Matt, why don't we come back to full screen for a moment?
It seems like a great example of what the imagination can produce if it's freed of what might seem like resources, but what might be constraints.
Yeah, I think this is as close to madness. This is not the sweet visions that we're going to get in the piece on Cantos. This is a mad vision. This is really quite terrifying. And it sounds to me like, if you wanted to psychologize it in a way, Ezra Pound is now trying to claim that everything he did for peace. And he's being besieged by these spirits that are welling up, whether they're out of the underworld of Homer or out of the Inferno of Dante or out of the ghost world of the No Drama. But each of these spirits comes and wants to keep the war going, and in some way is demanding something of Pound. First his body, then his voice. Then it's not clear, just his ear. I think this last spirit rages at him and rages about, the old popes, the old hierarchy of the church, the collusion of usury with the church, the era of, we're sort of in the era of Dante, and yet the spirit feels more real practically than just about any of the figures that we've seen so far in the cantos. I mean, I shouldn't say that, but the way the way Pound projects this encounter feels, more urgent and more ghost-like and more desperate. And this is the desperation of being in a war-torn country that's falling apart. There are flames in all directions. There are opposing armies coming from the north and from the south. There are bombers going overhead. There are cities on fire. There are rumors going around, and Pound is, in some kind of wildly desperate strait. And this is before he's been arrested and interred. So somebody else did translation of the Canto 73. Worth also checking into at some point, but this Canto 72 just feels to me like the last moment. A 750-year dead spirit has just grabbed Ezra Pound by the arm and pinned him to the wall. And in a way, it's an extraordinary prophecy of what's going to be happening to the man when he gets arrested and put into the cage at Pisa, where he's really going to be pinned to the wall in a way. And while the commentators like to bring up Dante, I think without even, let's say, consciously designing it this way, I think that Cantos 72 is an ideogram of an encounter with the dead. It's an ideogram of Dante, of Homer, or let's say Odysseus speaking with the dead, and the exact kind of spirits you encounter in some of the no plays. The no play are full of heroic Japanese warriors who have died and are now earthbound and want to keep on fighting. And Pound is just desperate here. It's like, here come the spirits and they want to keep fighting and they want his body, and he offers his voice or his cantos instead. And now they want his ear, and they rage about history, and they rage about usury, and they rage about the Catholic Church, and they rage about the medieval feuds. And in the end, we're left simply with the spirits warning that war will come back. The regiments and the banners will return. And I think this is a cry of desperation. And yet I think what made his daughter probably suppress it and never put it in the cantos, first of all, it was written in Italian. And second of all, it would not have looked good in American courts when Ezra Pound went back to Washington, D.C. to be put on trial for treason. Though that's out there into the future. These were written, it's thought in 1944. Nobody's really sure, but it's quite clear. Welcome, Matthew Morris. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Sorry, I'm not always able to make it. I have a conflict in my schedule. Sorry. Thank you for.
Okay, good to have you with us.
Thank you.
We just looked at Canto 72. You go back and review the recording if you like. But I think what we're going to do is leap from that into the piece on cantos. We don't know the date of Canto 72, but we're talking a year later, or some increment of a year, or some increment more than a year. And from Pound having his personal freedom, but his mental imprisonment in terrified, collapsed Italy, with the bombers overhead, the flames at ground level, the troops in the south, the troops in the north, the government falling apart, refugees on the road. If you can call up all your images of what the collapse of a country is in modern warfare, that's what Italy was. Corpses at the side of the road, explosions and machine gun fire in the distance. And that's what we got was Canto 72. Now we're going to move into Canto 74, and this is page 445, Matt. And I'll ask you to bear with me because I know we went over this last week, but I think it's worth going over again for many, many reasons. But one is to see where we left off the cantos just before Pound was imprisoned and where we're going to pick them up now. The Allied forces, particularly the American, but also the British and the French, have now secured Italy. They've even secured it enough that they can set up a detention center for American troops who have been accused of war crimes or who have deserted. And but it's still very much an occupying power. And to give you an idea, we've got a detention center with 7 cages in the middle, with Ezra Pound secured in an end cage that has been extra strengthened by welded steel to prevent him from escaping, and Klieg lights 24 hours on it. It's in sight of the gallows, the six potents that Pound speaks of in this cantos, and it is largely full of imprisoned American soldiers who have been accused of crimes of one sort or another. And this is where we're going to pick up, looking out onto the streets of Pisa or the outskirts of Pisa, including the tower and a mountain and what's going on the road. The enormous tragedy of the dream in the peasant's bent shoulders. Manet's was tanned and stuffed. Thus Ben and La Clara a Milano, by the heels at Milano, that maggots should eat the dead bullock. Digonos, but the twice crucified, where in history will you find it? That's why I wanted you to underline or, note that line near the beginning of Canto 72, twice born, twice died. This is referring in some ways to the old mythologies, back to Manes, the founder of Manichaeanism, who after death was tanned and stuffed for a second life, but also Benito Mussolini and his lover Clara slain and then hung up and shot again while they were hung in the plaza at Milan. So we've got the second birth of Manes, founder of the Manichaeans, and the second slaying or the second crucifixion of Ben and La Clara a Milano, by the heels at Milano, that maggots should eat the dead bullock, Digonos, which means twice born and is a term also for Dionysius. But the twice crucified, where in history will you find it? Yet say this to the possum, a bang, not a whimper, with a bang, not with a whimper. I want to remind you that this is T.S. Eliot's famous poem, The Hollow Men, which ends, this is how the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper. And here on the other side of World War II, out of his own direct experience, Pound can say to his old friend, yet say this to the possum, a bang, not a whimper, with a bang, not with a whimper, inverting T.S. Eliot, who is the possum. And I'm always really curious at the way that he phrases this. He doesn't speak directly to the possum, who he has been at several times in the cantos. He speaks directly to T.S. Eliot. Here he says, yet say this to the possum. He doesn't even know if T.S. Eliot is alive or dead. He doesn't know what T.S. Eliot thinks of the end of the war. A bang, not a whimper, with a bang, not with a whimper. And then he takes us all the way back to Canto 2, to build the city of Dioche, whose terraces are the color of stars. The suave eyes, quiet, not scornful. Note the suave eyes. Where did they come from? What are they? We'll see shortly in these cantos. But these are actually just eyes looking at him. This is the beginning of something really new. The suave eyes, quiet, not scornful. Rain also is of the process, taking us all the way back to Canto 2, where wind is of the process, the way, the Tao. Rain also is of the process. What you depart from is not the way. What you depart from is not the Tao. And olive tree blown white in the wind, washed in the Kiang and Han. What whiteness will you add to this whiteness? What candor? So I want to say again, the olive tree of the West, the Kiang and Han of China, olive tree blown white in the wind and washed in the Kiang and Han. The white here shouldn't be taken as our modern usage of whiteness. Pound has etymologized Confucius and discovered that the term that the translators use, candor, or the ideogram for candor, means light, but can go back to whiteness. To be candid, to have candor, is to be transparent, is to be full of light. So we've got the white of the olive tree washed in the Kiang and Han. And then these are lines from Confucius's deathbed, in which he's effectively saying, what candor can you add to this candor? What candor? And Pound's etymologizing either out of his dictionary or out of his notebook. But if you think that he's already taken on the mask of Confucius a number of times, I think it's very telling that what he remembers is Confucius dying. The great periplum brings in the stars to our shore. You who have passed the pillars and outward from Heracles, when Lucifer fell in North Carolina. If the suave air give way to Scirocco. Notice the suave eyes and now the suave air give way to Scirocco, which is one of these Mediterranean soft winds off the desert. And then back to Odysseus, the answer Odysseus gave to the Cyclops when the Cyclops says, what's your name? Oite, no man, no man. Oite, oite, Odysseus, the name of my family. The wind also is of the process. Sorella, la luna, sister moon. Fear God and the stupidity of the populace, but a precise definition transmitted thus Sigismundo, thus Duccio, thus Juan Bellin or Trastevere with La Sposa, Sponsa Christi and Mosaic till our time, deification of emperors. But a snotty barbarian ignorant of Tang history need not deceive one. Nor Charlie Sung's money on loan from Anonimo. That is, we suppose Charlie had some, and in India the rate down to 18 per 100. But the local loan lice provided from imported bankers, so the total interest sweated out of the Indian farmers rose in Churchillian grandeur. Again, back to that beginning of Cantos 72, where God, the great aesthete, created heaven and earth, and then exuded Geryon, the great usurer, and all the Churchillian usurists. And this is what Pound is looking at with the Indian farmers who are being bankrupted by the British war effort. As he says, the local loan lice provided from imported bankers. Rose in Churchillian grandeur as when and plus when he returned to the putrid gold standard, as was about 1925. You know, we've just been in this moment of that pontificating, somewhat ugly voice of Ezra Pound. You know, the local loan lice, the total interest sweated out of the Indian farmers, rose in Churchillian grandeur, as when and plus when he returned to the putrid gold standard, as was about 1925, a little blank, no period, just a little space. This is projectivism and the change in voice. Oh, my England, that free speech without free radio speech is as zero. And then back to the other voice, and but 1 point needed for Stalin. You need not, i.e., need not take over the means of production. Money to signify work done inside a system and measured and wanted. And then suddenly the voice of the chaplain who's there in the detention camp. I have not done unnecessary manual labor, says the RC, Roman Catholic Chaplain's Field Book, Preparation Before Confession. Squawky as larks over the death cells. Remember, Pound is in the death cells. He's on death row. Squawky as larks over the death cells. Militarism progressing westward. Investen nichts Neues, nothing new in the West, and the Constitution in jeopardy. And that state of things not very new either. And then just a little gap, but we know from the medical records that no sooner did Pound get at Pisa, he couldn't sleep because the Klieg lights were on him, and he was sleeping on the damp ground of Tuscany. And his eyes got infected from the combination of the dust and the sun and the Klieg lights. And he became insomniac from the pain and the lights. And we've just moved from that meditation on the Constitution to of sapphire, for this stone giveth sleep. A line we had much earlier, probably remembered out of some old handbook somewhere, but as though Pound is now trying to put a spell on himself to get to sleep. Of sapphire, for this stone giveth sleep. Not words whereto to be faithful, nor deeds that they be resolute. This is Confucius again, out of his memory. Only that bird-hearted equity make timber and lay hold of the earth. Such an interesting line. Bird-hearted equity make timber, make birdsong, make the sounds of birds, and lay hold of the earth. Remember in that Cantos 72, when it was like the confusion of the transmission, suddenly it was like squawking birds everywhere, like the squawking sounds you get on a radio. These are different birds. Only that bird-hearted equity make timber and lay hold of the earth. And Rouse found they spoke of Elias in telling the tales of Odysseus. Oite, no man, oite, no man. I am no man. My name is no man. And that's quite literal now for Pound. Nobody knows where he is. Nobody knows who he is. Nobody can come see him. There's no mail. He's in a cage. He's got armed guards around him. And the other inmates and the guards are under order not to speak to him. He's just a no man. And then he moves very quickly to a figure he was interested in, the anthropologist Frobenius, who did work in Australia. And one of the mythologies was this culture figure, Wandjina. But Wandjina is, shall we say, and now he takes Wandjina and translates it into Chinese, Wanjin, or the man with an education, and whose mouth was removed by his father because he made too many things, whereby cluttered the bushman's baggage. Vide the expedition of Frobenius's pupils about 1938 to Australia. Wanjin spoke and thereby created the named, thereby making clutter the bane of men moving, and so his mouth was removed. I think whatever is going on with Pound, he's He's looking at himself. He shot his mouth off and now he's on death row. Wan Jin spoke and thereby created the named, thereby making clutter the bane of men moving, and so his mouth was removed. Free speech on one side, a mouth that's been removed on the other. I mean, of these 2 pages we've just looked at. As you will find it removed in his pictures, in principio verbum, in the beginning, the word. Paraclete, or the verbum perfectum, sinceritas, the perfect word, sincerity, which Pound etymologized from Confucius. Sincerity, he saw in the ideogram that he translates sincerity, a man standing by his word, or a person standing by their word. He's struggling here with the difference between the sort of Confucian people who stand by their words, and in the beginning was the word, with this idea that if you speak and shoot off your mouth, you make clutter, and so your mouth is removed. And then suddenly we're back. He's looking out of his bars from the death cells in sight of Mount Taishan at Pisa. Mount Taishan is the great holy mountain of China, which Pound knows about from all his Chinese studies. And he's looking at a much smaller mountain, a kind of hill on the outskirts of Pisa, from the death cells in sight of Mount Taishan at Pisa, as Fujiyama at Gardone, when the cat walked the top bar of the railing and the water was still on the west side, flowing toward the Via Catullo, the Catullus' villa, where was sound ever moving in diminutive Palo Flois Boyos, in the stillness outlasting all wars. La donna, said Nicoletti, la donna, la donna, cosa deve continuare? Se casco, said Bianco Capello, non casco in ginocchian. Why must I go down? If I go on, said Bianca Capello, I will not fall on my knees. I will not go down on my knees. And with one day's reading, a man may have the key in his hands. This was also, I think, Olson picked this up from Pound. This was his famous bibliography of America to Ed Dorn. With one day's reading, if you go into one subject deeply, you've got the key to open up all other subjects. This is what Olson picked up and tried to pass on to Ed Dorn in his famous bibliography. And with one day's reading, a man may have the key in his hands. And now back to the mythologies that Frobenius got out of Africa, the old minstrel or troubadour Gassir, lute of Gassir. Gassir did a epic poem, and though it was oral and a repeated refrain like a mantra, hu fasa. And this is where Pound goes, lute of Gassir, hu Vasa. I just want to pause over that a moment, because the great epic is about the creation of a great city, but it has to be destroyed 4 times before it's properly built. This is out of Africa. So Pound is sort of likening that to the city of Dioche with its terraces the color of stars, and his attempts to write the earthly paradise. So he's just picking out a line from a creation myth there, lute of Gassir, Hufasa, and then we're right back in the little cell. Came a lion-colored pup bringing fleas. I don't think in our previous 446 pages of the Cantos, Ezra Pound would have stopped to see that a lion-colored pup had come in and brought fleas. This is really something very different happening here. Came a lion-colored pup bringing fleas. Notice right off of the what would you say, the African epic, Mufasa, came a lion-colored pup bringing fleas, and a bird with white markings, a stepper, under les six portants, the 6 gallows. Absoldre que tu nous vois, absoldre lay there Barabbas, and 2 thieves lay beside him, infantile synthesis in Barabbas, minus Hemingway, minus Antile, ebullient. And by name, Thomas Wilson. Mr. K said nothing foolish, the whole month nothing foolish. Thomas Wilson and Mr. K are 2 inmates in the detention center who Pound is beginning to pay attention to. Mr. K said nothing foolish, the whole month nothing foolish. If we weren't dumb, we wouldn't be here. And the Lane Gang, butterflies, mint, and lesbious sparrows, the voiceless with bum drum and banners, and the ideogram of the guard roosts. So he's looking up at the guard roosts or the guard towers at the 4 corners of the camp, and he's seeing that the guard roosts are forming an ideogram. And then he moves back into Italian and troubadour poetry. Il triste pensier si volge ad Ussel, then a sad thought turns towards Ussel. Il triste pensier si volge ad Ussel. Avvantador va il consire, el tempo rivolge. The thought turns back, the time turns back, el tempo rivolge. And suddenly Pound's back walking around southern France 30-some years earlier. And at Limoges, the young salesman bowed with such French politeness. No, that isn't possible. I've forgotten which city, but the caverns are less enchanting to the unskilled explorer than the Uroxes shown on the postals. We will see those old roads again? Question. Possibly, but nothing appears much less likely. Madame Pujol, and there was smell of mint under the tent flaps, especially after the rain, and a white ox on the road toward Pisa, as if facing the tower. Dark sheep in the drill field, and on wet days were clouds in the mountain, as if under the guard roosts. A lizard upheld me. The wild birds would not eat the white bread. From Mount Taishan to the sunset. Let's just hold there for a moment. Notice that tone of voice. He's gone back to just noticing the littlest things, the smell of mint under the tent flaps, especially after the rain. And then almost as though he's William Carlos Williams, he looks out and notices this could be Williams' red wheelbarrow and a white ox on the road toward Pisa, as if facing the tower. You know, you're sort of seeing the white ox, the tower, after the rain. And then he looks over dark sheep in the drill field. And on wet days were clouds in the mountains, as if under the guard roosts. And then the tone of voice is so simple here. A lizard upheld me. You know, I think as we go on, this would be a line to come back to. You know, Pound is really near breakdown. He's on death row. His eyes are inflamed. He's got no name. Nobody can talk to him. Nobody knows where he is. He's seen the lion-colored pup come in and bring fleas, and now a lizard. A lizard upheld me. The wild birds would not eat the white bread. He's trying to make friends with the birds out there, and they won't take his white bread. From Mount Taishan to the sunset, from Carrara stone to the tower, and this day the air was made open for Kwannon of all delights, the Buddhist goddess of mercy. This day the air was made open for Kwannon of all delights, Linus, Cletus, Clement, whose prayers the great scarab is bowed at the altar. The green light gleams in his shell, plowed in the sacred field and unwound the silkworms early, intensile. And that ideogram there, Xian, to illuminate, to be illustrious. Ezra Pound will look at it as an image of the sun and maybe an image of the moon. Maybe legs or animal legs underneath, the movement of light. This is how Pound is reading these things now. But we've got the tensile light. In the light of light is the virtu. Sunt lumina, said Erigenes Scotus. Sunt lumina we've had before. That would be like our light. Everything that is light, said Erigenes Scotus. As of Shun on Mount Taishan, Shun being one of the great early Chinese culture heroes, early emperor. Everything that is light, said Erigenes Scotus, as of Shun on Mount Taishan. And in the hall the forebears, as from the beginning of wonders, the paraclete or the hermit that was present in Yao, the precision in Shun the compassionate, in you the guider of waters. 4 giants at the 4 corners, that's the 4 guard roosts, 3 young men at the door, and they digged a ditch round about me, lest the damp gnaw through my bones. To redeem Zion with justice, said Isaiah, not out on interest, said David Rex, the prime SOB. Light, tensile, immaculata, the sun's cord unspotted. Again, that ideogram at the top of the page, Pound is reading as the tensile light or the cord of the sun. So we've got light tensile, the light that is everything, and now light tensile immaculata, the sun's cord unspotted. Sunt lumina is light, everything is light, said the Irishman, Erigenes Scotus, to King Carolus. Omnia, everything, all things that are lights. And I think this is historically true. And they dug them up out of sepulture, swa distantly looking for Manichaeans. This was the church fathers of the time. They thought that Erigenes Scotus was a Manichaean, and so they dug him up to burn his remains. Almost an ideogram of the opposite of Malatesta bringing Gemistos' ashes back to be revered in the sepulchre at Rimini. Here are the church fathers digging up Scotus swa distantly, as though distantly looking for Manichaeans. Les Albigeois, a problem of history. And the fleet at Salamis made with money lent by the state to the shipwrights. Tempus tacendi, tempus loquendi, a time to talk, a time to be silent, a time to speak, straight out of the Bible and out of Thomas Jefferson. Tempus tacendi, tempus loquendi, never inside the country to raise the standard of living, but always abroad to increase the profits of usurers. Dixit Lenin. And gun sales lead to more gun sales. They do not clutter the market for gunnery. There is no saturation. Pisa, in the 23rd year of the effort in sight of the tower, and Till was hung yesterday. This is one of his cellmates there, along the line of cages. And Till was hung yesterday for murder and rape with trimmings, plus Cholkis, plus mythology. Thought he was Zeus Ram or another one. Hey, Snag, what's in the Bible? What are the books of the Bible? Name them. Don't bullshit me. Oi, te. And that's the ideogram for no man. A man on whom the sun has gone down. The ewe, he said, had such a pretty look in her eyes. And the nymph of the Hagoromo came to me as a corona of angels. The movement here is, really rather intense. He's just noted that yesterday his cellmate Till was hung for murder and rape, a man on whom the sun has gone down. And then suddenly the nymph of the Hagoromo comes to him as a corona of angels. One day were clouds banked on Taishan, or in glory of sunset, and Tovarish blessed without aim, wept in the rain ditch at evening, sunt lumina, that the drama is wholly subjective, stone knowing the form which the carver imparts it. The stone knows the form, sia Cythera, sia Quixota, sia in Santa Maria de Miracole, where Pietro Romano has fashioned the bases. Oi te, no name, a man on whom the sun has gone down. Nor shall diamond die in the avalanche, be it torn from its setting. First must destroy himself, ere others destroy him. 4 times was a city rebuilded. Fasa. This is straight out of that African epic. Gasir, Fasa, dell'Italia tradita, now in the mind indestructible. Gasir, Fasa, with the 4 giants at the 4 corners and 4 gates mid-wall. Fasa, and a terrace the color of stars, pale as the dawn cloud. La Luna, thin as Demeter's hair. Another image in there, I think only Ezra Pound can go from a terrace the color of stars, pale as the dawn cloud, to La Luna, the moon thin as Demeter's hair. Fasa, and in a dance the renewal, with 2 larks in contrapunto at sunset. Cintenarise, that softens, a sinistra la torre, to the left of the tower, seen through a pair of breeches. I think there's a pair of, army breeches hung up on the line to dry, and Pound seeing 2 larks in counterpoint dancing together at sunset in the softness to the left of the tower, seen through a pair of breeches. Che sublia Elisa Cader, a line from Bernard de Ventadorn, a poem about the larks. So if you notice, Pound has seen what he thinks of as 2 larks out there dancing. He's got no books, but he can remember some of the poetry. Che sublia Elisa Cader, which means something like who forgot and let themselves fall. Between Nakia, that's the Nakia where the dead have come up to see Odysseus, where are Alcmene and Tyro, and the Charybdis of action, to the solitude of Mount Taishan. Femina, that would not be dragged into paradise by the hair. Under the gray cliff in Paraplum, the sun dragging her stars, a man on whom the sun has gone down. And the wind came as Hamadryas under the sunbeat. Vaisoli are never alone amid the slaves learning slavery and the dull driven back toward the jungle, are never alone. Hyon, Hepi, Hyon, the sun around the sun. As the light sucks up vapor and the tides follow Lucina, that had been a hard man in some ways. A day is 1,000 years, as the leopard sat by his water dish. Has killed the urox and the bison, said Bunting, doing 6 months after that war was over, as pacifists tempted with chicken, but declined to approve of war. This is Basil Bunting, great British poet who is Pound's sort of disciple and friend. Basil Bunting doing 6 months after the war was over, which is World War I, because he had refused to fight as a conscientious objector, as pacifists tempted with chicken, but declined to approve of war, read Amiculum Metallorum. That's the name of Basil Bunting's first book, privately printed, to the shame of various critics. Nevertheless, the state can lend money, and the fleet that went out to Salamis was built by state loan to the builders. Hence the attack on classical studies. And in this war were Joe Gould, Bunting, and Cummings, as against thickness and fatness. Black that die in captivity, night green of his pupil, as grape flesh and sea wave undying and translucent. That black that die in captivity, Pound told somebody that that was his memory of having seen a black panther in the zoo in Rome in the cage, that die in captivity. I wonder, though, if it's also an echo of him having seen Till just hung the day before. Most of the inmates of the camp are black that die in captivity. I think there's an ideogram. It's not a simple explanation of what it is that's black that dies in captivity. Night green of his pupil is grape flesh and sea wave, undying, luminous, and translucent. As consummatum ite, surrounded by herds and by cohorts, looked on Mount Taishan. But in Tangier I saw from dead straw ignition. From a snake bite, fire came to the straw. From the fakir blowing, foul straw, an arm-long snake that bit the tongue of the fakir, making holes. And from the blood of the holes came fire when he stuffed the straw into his mouth. Dirty straw that he took from the roadway for smoke, and then the dull flame. That would have been in the time of Rais Uli, when I rode out to Elson's near the villa of Perdicaris, or 4 years before that. Elemental, he thought, the souls of the children, if any, but had rented a shelter for travelers, by foot from Syria, some of them. Nor is it for nothing that the chrysalids mate in the air. Color de luce, color of light, green splendor, and as the sun through pale fingers, lordly men are to earth o'ergiven. These the companions. And now a little, we've gone from that sort of memory, Pound having seen in Tangier when he was young, this fakir doing magics, making flame out of dead straw in his mouth, and then sort of seeing the chrysalids mating in the air, which sounds like he's looking at it outside of his cage, and seeing them color de luce, green splendor, or he sees them as They're both green and splendid, and they're the color of light. They're as the sun through pale fingers. And then sudden, without interruption, lordly men are to earth o'ergiven. These the companions, and these are his friends who died during the war. 40 that wrote of giants, that's Ford Madox Ford, who was Pound's early publisher and close friend in London. 40 that wrote of giants, and William, who dreamed of nobility, William Butler Yeats, and Jim, the comedian, singing, that's James Joyce, Blarney Castle, me darling, you're nothing now but a stone. And Plar, talking of mathematics, or Jepson, lover of jade, Morey, who wrote historical novels, and Newbolt, who looked twice bathed, are to earth o'ergiven. And this day the sun was clouded. You sit stiller, said Coca, if whenever you move something jangles. And the old Marchesa remembered a reception in Petersburg, and Coca thought there might be some society, good, left in Spain. Would he care to frequent it? My God, no. Opinion in 1924. Sirdar, Bouillet, and Elias, or Dieudonné London, or Voisin's. Uncle George stood like a statesman. Pehanta fills up every hollow. The cake shops in the Nevsky. And Schöner's, not to mention their grief at Bolzano, La Patronne getting older. This is actually a list of restaurants in London and Paris that Pound's just remembering having been in. The Cafe Society, La Patronne getting older, Moquin's or Robert's 40 years after. And La Marquise de Pierre had never before met an American, and all their generation. No, it is not in that chorus. Huddy going out and taller than anyone present. Oh, Sans les Heures of that year. There's Villon again, the other famous poet who'd been on who had been on death row. Où sont les heures of yesteryear? Where have gone the hours of the gone years? Mr. James shielding himself with Mrs. Hawksby, as it were a bowl shielding itself with a walking stick. This is probably the most humor Pound ever put into an image. Henry James shielding himself with a Mrs. Hawksby, as it were a bowl shielding itself with a walking stick, as he maneuvered his way toward the door. Said Mr. Adams of the education. Teach at Harvard? Teach? It cannot be done. And this I had from the moment. Hic sunt fasti. These are the fasteners under Taishan. 14 juillet, 14th July, Pound's moving into different languages here. Under Taishan, 14 juillet. With the hill ablaze north of Taishan, and Amber Reeves is dead. The end of that chapter. See time for June 25th. Notice just the dates being put in here now. Pound's actually putting in the moments that he's writing. It's the 14th of July, and he's just seeing Time magazine from June 25th and learning that his old friend Amber Reeves is dead. Mr. Graham himself unmistakably on a horse, an ear and the beard's point showing, and the Farben work still intact, to the tune of Lili Bolero, and they have bitched the Adelphi. Niggers scaling the obstacle fence in the middle distance, and Mr. Edwards, superb green and brown in Ward number 4, adjacent benignity of the Baluba mask. This is one of the inmates. Don't you tell no one I made you that table. This is somebody who had made Pound a writing table for his cage, but don't you tell no one I made you that table. It was apparently made out of an old ammunition box. And then suddenly into the treatment pounds getting in the tent. Methenamine eases the urine, and the greatest is charity, to be found among those who have not observed regulations. Not, of course, that we advocate, and yet petty larceny in a regime based on grand larceny might rank as conformity. Nient altro, or nothing else, with justice shall be redeemed, who putteth not out his money on interest. So what I imagine this means is that Mr. Edwards, who's imprisoned in this camp and has built Pound the Table, it's him that makes Pound think that the greatest is charity, to be found among those who have not observed regulations. Not, of course, that we advocate, and yet petty larceny, which is probably what Mr. Edwards is in the camp for, petty larceny, in a regime based on grand larceny, might rank as conformity. Nient altro, would it not? With justice shall be deemed, who putteth not out his money on interest. In meat yard and weight or in measure, 19 Leviticus or 1 Thessalonians 4:11, 300 years culture at the mercy of a tack hammer thrown through the roof. Cloud over mountain, mountain over the cloud. I surrender neither the empire, nor the temples, plural, nor the constitution, nor yet this city of Dioche. Each one in his God's name, as by Terracina rose from the sea, Zephyr behind her, and from her manner of walking, as had Anchises, till the shrine be white with marble, till the stone eyes look seaward again. The wind is part of the process. The rain is part of the process. And the Pleiades set in her mirror. Guanon, this stone bringeth sleep. Why don't we stop there? This would be page 455. And I think we'll just pick right back up there and begin to see the increasing appearance of these sort of goddess figures and deities and visions and images. We've mostly had Pound exposing his state of mind and thinking of some poems and worrying about things and remembering his friends who have died during the war and remembering the cafes of Paris and London. And now we're about to go into a point where the visions are really going to overtake him. We know that he's being treated for urinary infection or something with a methenamine. We know he's being treated for infections in his eyes. We know he's watching prisoners hung. We know he's dislocated. He thinks of himself as a no man. And we'll see what kind of movement of mind begins to come as he continues with this canto. Any thoughts or comments anybody wants to make before we break? You're welcome to read forward into the book if you like, or stay with it and we'll just read it, as a group next time and look at the different modes Pound goes through. But as you can see, from the point of view of many people, there's much more collage and cut up. There's also much more personal material coming into the poem now, but it's not really cut up because he's not cutting up anything. It's just the movement of mind. And this is, I think, what really was gathered in by Charles Olson and very, very influential on people like Ginsberg and Snyder and Kerouac and De Prima and, that whole generation who many of them came into modernist poetry through this book. Well, we'll stop here then. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.